October 15, 2004. Miguel Santos had been watching Griselda Blanco for 3 months. The woman who built a billion-dollar cocaine empire was now inmate 47291, mopping floors under his supervision. At 3:47 a.m., 4 inmates cornered her in the laundry room. Makeshift knives, no cameras, perfect setup. Miguel heard the first scream through the walls. His hand moved to his radio, then stopped. This was the woman whose cartel murdered his daughter. This was justice. But when the screaming stopped, and he found Blanco standing over 4 bodies with blood on her hands and a smile on her face, she looked directly at him and said 5 words that changed everything. "Hello, Agent Santos. We're even." The next morning, the warden found a file on his desk, crime scene photos from 1987, a little girl's body, and a DEA badge number that belonged to a dead man. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Warden Patricia Hayes stared at the photographs spread across her mahogany desk like tarot cards predicting doom. The crime scene images were decades old but pristine. A 7-year-old girl's broken body in a Miami alley, her school uniform torn, dark hair matted with blood. The DEA badge number at the bottom of the file read, Agent Miguel Santos, badge 4729th. Killed in action October 16, 1987. Except Miguel Santos walked her halls every day, checking cells and breaking up fights. Hayes reached for her coffee with trembling fingers. In 23 years running federal corrections facilities, she'd learned to spot the ghosts, men and women hiding from their past, seeking penance in concrete and razor wire. But this was different. This was impossible. Her intercom buzzed. "Ma'am, Officer Santos is here for his shift report. Send him in." The door opened, and Miguel entered as he had 1,000 times before. Same measured gait, same weathered face that never quite met her eyes, same regulation uniform pressed to military precision. But now Hayes saw the careful way he held himself, the hypervigilance masked as casual awareness. How had she missed it? "Morning, Warden. About last night's incident." "Sit down, Miguel." He paused mid-sentence, reading her tone. His eyes flicked to the desk, but the photos were face down. Still, something shifted in his posture. The corrections officer disappeared, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "There a problem?" Hayes turned one photograph over. The little girl's face, peaceful in death despite the violence that claimed her. "Want to tell me about your daughter, Agent Santos?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Miguel's jaw worked soundlessly before he sank into the chair across from her desk. For the first time in 8 years, he looked directly at her. "Where did you get that?" "Someone left it for me, along with your real badge number and a very interesting death certificate." She leaned back. "Funny thing about fake deaths, they require serious federal connections. DEA? FBI? Or did you go straight to the marshals?" Miguel's laugh was bitter. "Marshals don't fake deaths for agents who go rogue, Patricia. They hunt them. So you did go rogue." "I went after the animals who killed my Carmen, and when I got too close, my own partner sold me out." His voice was gravel and broken glass. "Set me up for an ambush in Medellin. I barely escaped with enough evidence to buy my own disappearance." Hayes studied him. 8 years you've worked for me. Never a complaint, never a problem. Model employee. Were you planning to kill Blanco? Every damn day. The honesty hit like a physical blow. But you didn't. "No." Miguel rubbed his face. "Because when I walked into that laundry room last night, expecting to find her corpse, she was standing there like some avenging angel, 4 bodies at her feet, and she knew exactly who I was." He looked up. "She's been playing me for 3 months. The inmates who attacked her, who sent them. Still working on that, but Griselda's got ideas." Miguel stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the yard. "She wants to make a deal." "With you?" "With both of us." He turned back. "Says she knows who set up my family. Claims she can prove my old partner's been running drugs through federal facilities for decades." His smile was sharp enough to cut. "Including this one." Hayes felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "That's impossible." "Is it?" How else would someone get crime scene photos from a classified DEA file onto your desk overnight? Miguel moved closer. Someone with serious juice wanted you to know who I am. Question is why? The intercom crackled. Warden Hayes, we have a situation in Block C. Inmate Blanco is refusing to return to her cell. She's asking for Officer Santos. Hayes and Miguel locked eyes. Through the window, storm clouds gathered over the California hills, casting shadows across the prison yard. Somewhere in the building, the woman who'd built an empire on blood and powder was making demands. And the ghost of a dead DEA agent was about to answer. This is insane, Hayes whispered. Miguel straightened his uniform and moved toward the door. Welcome to my world, Warden. Been living in insane for 17 years. As his hand touched the doorknob, Hayes called out, Miguel, if she's lying, if this is some elaborate con. He paused without turning around. Then I'll finish what those inmates started last night. Carmen's been waiting long enough for justice. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Hayes alone with the photographs and the growing certainty that her orderly world was about to explode. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley like distant artillery, and the first drops of rain began to fall. In Block C, Griselda Blanco was waiting. Introduction. The walk to Block C stretched like a death march through Miguel's memory. Each footstep on the polished linoleum echoed with the rhythm of rain on a Miami cemetery 17 years ago. The day he'd buried his daughter and his former life in the same grave. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows that reminded him of the DEA office where he'd first seen Carmen's crime scene photos, where his partner, Tommy Reeves, had placed a consoling hand on his shoulder and sworn they'd get the bastards responsible. The same Tommy who'd sold them out to save his own skin. Miguel's keys jangled against his hip with each step, a metallic percussion that grounded him in the present. FCI Dublin hummed around him with its familiar sounds. The distant clang of steel doors, muffled conversations through concrete walls, the perpetual background noise of 1,000 women trying to survive in a place designed to break them. For 8 years, these sounds had been his sanctuary. The predictable rhythm of institutional life had given him something his old existence never could, the illusion of control. A passing inmate nodded respectfully. Morning, Officer Santos. Morning, Rodriguez. The response came automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of similar exchanges. But today, the words tasted different, contaminated by truth. How many times had he walked these halls carrying the weight of his deception? How many quiet moments had he stolen, pretending to be just another correctional officer working toward retirement? The rec room door stood open, revealing a dozen women clustered around a television. A cooking show played, the celebrity chef's cheerful banter a stark contrast to the tension Miguel felt coiling in his chest. One inmate glanced up, Maria Vasquez, serving 10 years for trafficking, and something flickered in her eyes. Knowledge? Fear? In this place, information moved like wildfire, and by now every woman in the block knew something had shifted in the natural order. Miguel's fingers found the small photograph in his breast pocket. Not the crime scene image Hayes had shown him, but the other one. Carmen at 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning on the swing set behind their Miami duplex. Her dark hair caught sunlight like spun silk, and her laugh seemed to echo from the faded paper. This was his talisman, his reminder of what justice actually looked like before it became twisted into revenge. He'd carried that photo through 3 countries and a dozen identities. Through the underground railroad of favors and bribes that had eventually landed him here, in the belly of the federal prison system where ghosts could hide among the living. The irony wasn't lost on him. Seeking sanctuary in the same institution that housed the woman responsible for his daughter's death, the Block C checkpoint materialized ahead, manned by Officer Janet Park. 22 years old, fresh from the academy, still believing the system worked the way it was supposed to. She looked up from her paperwork with obvious relief. Thank God you're here, Santos. She's been asking for you specifically for the past hour, won't say why, won't go back to her cell, won't even accept breakfast. Park's voice dropped to a whisper. The other inmates are getting restless. Word about last night is spreading. and there's talk about whether Blanco's untouchable now or if she's showing weakness." Miguel nodded, processing the implications. In prison, perception was reality, and reality could turn deadly in minutes. "Anyone else been by? Visitors? Legal counsel?" "Just her lawyer this morning. Left about 30 minutes ago looking like someone had pissed in his cornflakes." Park hesitated. "Santos? Is it true what they're saying? That she took out 4 women with just a laundry iron?" "3 women," Miguel corrected automatically, then caught himself. How did Park know details that weren't in any official report? The information leak was wider than he'd thought, which meant more players were involved. "And you know better than to listen to jailhouse gossip." But even as he said it, Miguel remembered the scene from last night. Griselda Blanco standing in that laundry room like some ancient goddess of war, blood spatter decorating her prison uniform, that knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She'd looked at him and spoken his real name. Not the identity he'd worn for 8 years, but the one he'd buried with his daughter. The one that meant someone had been watching him all along. Thunder rumbled outside, closer now, and Miguel felt the atmospheric pressure change in his bones. Storms in California's Central Valley could turn violent without warning, and he'd learned to read the signs. The same instincts that had kept him alive through 17 years of running were screaming now, warning him that walking into that cell block was crossing a line he could never uncross. At the end of the corridor, Block C waited. Behind those steel doors, Griselda Blanco sat with secrets that could either damn him or set him free. And somewhere in the shadows, Miguel's past was reaching forward to claim him. He touched Carmen's photograph one last time and stepped into the storm. The steel door to Block C slammed shut behind Miguel with the finality of a coffin lid. The sound reverberated through his bones, and for a moment he was 17 years younger, standing in a Miami warehouse as Tommy Reeves's voice crackled through his radio earpiece. "All clear, Miguel. Move in." The same tone of false reassurance that had led him into an ambush. The same tone he'd heard on the phone call that changed everything. Miguel's hand instinctively moved to his radio, but instead of the familiar weight of his service weapon, he felt only the institutional bulk of his corrections belt. Keys, flashlight, pepper spray, tools for maintaining order, not dispensing justice. The transformation felt complete in that moment. The final severing of Agent Santos from Officer Santos. "She's in cell 47, Officer Park had said, but Miguel could have found Griselda Blanco blindfolded. The block had gone unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that preceded violence or revelation. Even the chronic talkers had stopped their chatter, sensing that something fundamental was shifting in their carefully balanced ecosystem. Miguel's footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as he approached her cell. Each step brought fragments of memory, Carmen's voice on the phone that October evening, excited about her school play. "Daddy, I'm going to be a princess. Will you come watch me?" He'd promised he would, had already cleared the evening despite being deep in surveillance of a Medellin cartel money laundering operation. The operation Tommy had assured him was bulletproof. Cell 47 came into view, and Miguel's breath caught. Griselda Blanco sat on her narrow bunk with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for class to begin. But her eyes, those predator's eyes, tracked his approach with calculating intelligence. She wore standard-issue orange, yet somehow managed to make the shapeless uniform look regal. This was a woman who had commanded armies of killers, who had built an empire from nothing but ambition and blood. "Officer Santos," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach him but not the neighboring cells. "Or should I say, Miguel? I've been expecting you." Miguel stopped 3 feet from the bars, close enough to see the faint scarring along her knuckles, distant enough to avoid her reach. Training kicked in automatically, but this wasn't about prison protocol anymore. This was about the phone call that had destroyed his life. "You know why I'm here." "Do I?" Griselda's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Perhaps you're here because someone wanted you to be. Someone who has been very patient, very careful." She stood gracefully, moving to the bars with the confidence of a woman who had never truly been caged. "Tell me, Miguel, do you remember the last conversation you had with your partner before Carmen died?" The words hit like a physical blow. Miguel's vision tunneled, And suddenly he was back in that cramped surveillance van, listening to Tommy's voice through static. "We've got a problem, partner. They made us. You need to get your family out of Miami. Tonight." But Tommy had called him at home, not on the radio. Had called him on the secure line that only his partner knew about. "I remember," Miguel said, his voice barely audible. "Do you?" "Because I remember it too." Griselda's fingers wrapped around the bars, knuckles white with pressure. October 15th, 1987, 9:47 p.m. "Your partner called to warn you that the cartel knew about Carmen, that they were coming for your family." Miguel's world tilted. That was impossible. The call had come at 9:52, he was certain of it. He'd checked the kitchen clock twice, burned the time into his memory because those 5 minutes had felt like hours as he'd tried to reach Carmen's school, tried to get them into protective custody. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Because I also remember the other call, the one that came 5 minutes later." Griselda's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "The one where your partner gave my people Carmen's exact location." The corridor spun around Miguel. He grabbed the wall for support as 17 years of carefully constructed truth crumbled like wet cardboard. Tommy hadn't just failed to protect them, he'd actively betrayed them, had warned Miguel to create the perfect alibi while simultaneously delivering Carmen to her killers. "That's impossible." Tommy was your best friend, your trusted partner. Griselda laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He was also a very practical man. "We offered him 2 choices, accept our money and occasionally look the other way, or watch his own family join yours in the grave." Miguel's legs gave out. He slumped against the concrete wall, his mind reeling through 18 months of partnership with Tommy Reeves. The subtle changes in behavior he'd attributed to stress, the way Tommy had always seemed one step ahead of their investigations, the convenient equipment failures and mistimed raids that had let high-value targets slip away. "The warehouse ambush in Medellin," Miguel whispered. "He set that up too." "Of course he did. When you started getting too close to the truth about Carmen's death, we told him to clean up his mess." Griselda's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "But you were always too smart for your own good, Miguel. You survived, went underground, and Tommy thought you were dead. Until 3 months ago, when I was assigned to your detail, when someone told him exactly where to find the ghost of Miguel Santos. The final piece fell into place with devastating clarity. Someone had orchestrated all of this, had arranged for Griselda's transfer to FCI Dublin, had made sure Miguel would be assigned to her security detail, had dropped those photographs on Warden Hayes' desk. But who? And why now? Thunder crashed outside, shaking the building's foundations. Miguel looked up at the woman who had haunted his nightmares for 17 years and realized she might be the only person who could give him the truth about his daughter's death, the only person who could help him destroy Tommy Reeves. The emergency klaxon shattered the morning quiet at 7:23 a.m., its metallic shriek cutting through the institutional calm like a blade. Miguel's radio crackled to life as he sat in the break room, staring at coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The conversation with Griselda had left him feeling like a man whose bones had been replaced with glass, fragile, hollow, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. "All units to Block D, Code Orange. Repeat, Code Orange in Block D." Miguel's training kicked in automatically, but his mind remained trapped in Cell 47, replaying Griselda's words about Tommy Reeves, about phone calls and timing, and the careful orchestration of his daughter's murder. He stood, muscles moving through practiced motions, while his thoughts churned in darker currents. The corridor buzzed with activity. Officers jogged past, their faces tight with professional focus, but Miguel caught something else in their expressions, a nervous energy that went beyond routine emergency response. Officer Martinez rushed by, then stopped, doubling back with obvious reluctance. "Santos? You need to see this." Block D housed the medium security inmates, women serving sentences for white-collar crimes and mid-level drug offenses. It was supposed to be the quiet wing, the place where former accountants and suburban dealers counted down their years in relative peace. Miguel had walked these halls 1,000 times without incident. Today felt different. The air thrummed with tension as officers established a perimeter around Cell 23. Through the crowd, Miguel glimpsed EMTs wheeling out a covered gurney, moving with the deliberate pace that meant no medical emergency, just cleanup. "What happened?" Miguel asked, though part of him already knew. Officer Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran with steady hands and steady nerves, looked pale as cemetery marble. Inmate Patricia Volkov, Russian mob connections, serving 8 years for money laundering. He paused, glancing around as if the walls might be listening. Someone got to her in the shower. Professional job, single puncture wound, precise angle, probably bled out in under 2 minutes. Miguel's blood turned to ice water. Patricia Volkov had been one of the inmates who'd witnessed the aftermath in the laundry room. One of the women who'd seen Griselda standing over those bodies like some ancient goddess of vengeance. In prison, witnesses were either protected or eliminated, and the federal system had just demonstrated which option they preferred. Any suspects? The question came out rougher than intended. Rodriguez shook his head, but his eyes told a different story. Happened during shift change. Cameras were down for maintenance. Scheduled outage, logged 3 days ago. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Funny thing about the timing, though. Guard rotation had Volkov's shower block empty for exactly 12 minutes. Professional window. The implications hit Miguel like a physical blow. This wasn't random prison violence or gang retribution. Someone with access to schedules, security protocols, and maintenance logs had orchestrated Patricia Volkov's death. Someone inside the system. Santos. Warden Hayes appeared at his shoulder, her face carved from stone. "My office, now." The walk back felt like swimming through molasses. Miguel's peripheral vision caught fragments, officers whispering in clusters, inmates pressed against cell doors trying to gather intelligence, the subtle shifts in body language that indicated institutional fear. News traveled fast in prison, but this news was traveling with the speed of wildfire. Hayes's office door slammed shut behind them with uncommon force. She moved to her window, staring out at the yard where normal routines continued despite the chaos inside. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades maintaining order in an inherently chaotic world. Patricia Volkov was scheduled to give a statement about last night's incident. She was supposed to be in protective custody. Hayes turned, and Miguel saw something in her expression he'd never witnessed before: genuine fear. Someone with administrator-level access canceled the transfer order at 6:15 this morning. Electronic signature, proper authorization codes. Miguel's mouth went dry. Who signed off? That's the interesting part. Hayes moved to her desk, fingers trembling slightly as she accessed her computer. The authorization came from Deputy Warden Morrison. Except Morrison's been in Sacramento since yesterday, testifying before a state oversight committee. Hasn't been near a computer terminal in 18 hours. The room felt smaller suddenly, walls pressing in with suffocating inevitability. Miguel thought about Tommy Reeves, about 17-year-old betrayals and carefully timed phone calls, about someone with the patience to orchestrate a ghost's resurrection and the power to kill witnesses inside a federal facility. "There's something else," Hayes continued, her voice barely steady. "This morning I received a call from the Bureau of Prisons Regional Office. They're conducting an unscheduled inspection of our security protocols, specifically focusing on recent personnel assignments and inmate transfers." Miguel's radio squawked again, Officer Santos to Block C inmate Blanco, requesting immediate consultation. Through the window, storm clouds gathered with ominous intent, and Miguel realized that Griselda hadn't been making idle threats. She'd been issuing warnings. The game had changed, the stakes elevated beyond personal vengeance into something far more dangerous. Someone was systematically eliminating witnesses, and Miguel Santos, the ghost who'd tried to stay safely buried, had just become the primary target. Miguel's hands shook as he walked toward Block C, each step feeling like walking toward his own execution. The radio call from Griselda wasn't a request, it was a summons, and they both knew it. Behind him, Hayes's office door remained closed, but he could feel the weight of institutional paranoia pressing down like a physical thing. Someone was cleaning house, and Miguel had just realized he'd never been the hunter in this scenario. He'd always been the prey. The corridor to Block C stretched endlessly ahead, fluorescent lights flickering with electrical uncertainty that matched the chaos in Miguel's mind. Patricia Volkov's body was already in the morgue, another witness silenced with surgical precision. But it was the method that terrified him most. Not the violence itself, but the casual efficiency of it. Someone had orchestrated her death like conducting a symphony, every note perfectly timed, every movement choreographed, just like Carmen's murder 17 years ago. Miguel paused at a security checkpoint, his keycard trembling in his hand. The officer manning the station, Johnson, a 20-year veteran with eyes like granite, looked up from his paperwork with an expression Miguel couldn't quite read. "Rough morning," Johnson said, but there was something underneath the words, a probing quality that made Miguel's skin crawl. Yeah, bad business with Volkov. "Funny thing about bad business," Johnson continued, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. "Sometimes it follows people around, like a curse or something." Miguel's blood froze. Johnson had never spoken to him beyond basic pleasantries in 8 years of service. Now he was making conversation that sounded suspiciously like a threat. Miguel forced his voice to remain steady as he swiped his card. Sometimes it does. The lock clicked open, but Miguel could feel Johnson's eyes following him through the checkpoint. Another name to add to the list of people who might not be who they seemed. The paranoia was spreading like cancer, making him question every interaction, every casual word. How many of his colleagues knew who he really was? How long had he been walking among enemies wearing friendly faces? Block C appeared ahead, but Miguel's radio crackled again before he could reach Griselda's cell. "Santos, report to administrative processing. Priority 1. He stopped dead in the corridor. Administrative processing was where they handled internal investigations, disciplinary hearings, and personnel terminations. Being called there during an active crisis meant one of two things. He was either being pulled into protective custody or he was about to be arrested. Miguel keyed his radio with hands that had steadied into deadly calm. "On my way." But instead of turning around, he continued toward Block C. If they wanted him, they could come get him. But first, he needed answers that only Griselda Blanco could provide. The game was ending, had probably been ending since the moment he'd walked into FCI Dublin, and he refused to die in ignorance. Cell 47 came into view, and Griselda was waiting exactly as he'd expected. She stood at the bars with perfect composure, but something in her posture had changed. The predatory confidence was still there, but underneath it Miguel detected something he'd never seen in her before: urgency. "They killed Patricia," he said without preamble. "Of course they did. Just like they killed the maintenance worker who saw you talking to me yesterday. Just like they're going to kill anyone else who connects us." Griselda's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who understood the mathematics of survival. "How long before you figured out that Tommy Reeves isn't the one pulling the strings?" Miguel felt the world tilt again. "What are you talking about?" "Your partner was always small time, Miguel. A middleman with delusions of importance." Griselda moved closer to the bars, her eyes locked on his with laser intensity. "The person who arranged Carmen's death, who's been tracking you for 17 years, who orchestrated my transfer here, that's someone with real power, someone who's been playing a much longer game." "Who?" But before Griselda could answer, Miguel heard footsteps echoing from the checkpoint behind him, multiple sets, moving with military precision. His radio buzzed again: "All units, locate and detain Officer Santos for immediate questioning." Miguel looked back at Griselda, seeing his own desperation reflected in her eyes. The net was closing, and they both knew it. But in that moment, he saw something else in her expression, something that looked almost like regret. "Your daughter," she whispered urgently. Carmen wasn't just random collateral damage. She was specifically targeted because of what she saw, what she could identify. Griselda's knuckles went white against the bars. "And Miguel? She didn't die that night in Miami." The footsteps were getting closer. Miguel's world collapsed into a single point of impossible hope and devastating terror. 17 years of grief, of guilt, of carefully constructed truth, all of it crumbling like sand. Where is she? But the footsteps had reached Block C, and Miguel Santos was out of time. Plot twist. Miguel's world stopped. The footsteps behind him, the static on his radio, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, everything faded into white noise as Griselda's words carved themselves into his consciousness like acid on metal. She didn't die that night in Miami. That's impossible, he breathed. But even as the words left his mouth, fragments of memory began shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns he'd never allowed himself to see. The closed casket funeral, the dental records that had taken 3 weeks to process, the way the Miami-Dade detective had avoided eye contact when delivering the news, speaking in carefully rehearsed phrases about definitive identification and closure for the family. Santos, step away from the cell. The voice behind him belonged to Captain Morrison, not the deputy warden, but the head of internal security. Miguel didn't turn around. Where is she? His voice cracked like breaking glass. Griselda's eyes held depths he'd never seen before, not the calculating coldness of a killer, but something almost human. The night Carmen was taken, she witnessed something she shouldn't have, a meeting between federal agents and cartel representatives. She saw faces, heard names. They couldn't just kill her. They needed to know what she remembered first. The footsteps were 20 feet away. Miguel could hear the jingle of handcuffs, the whispered coordination of officers moving into position. But 17 years of buried hope was clawing its way out of his chest like something alive and desperate. They kept her alive, Griselda continued urgently. Plastic surgery, new identity, relocation. The girl who died in Miami was a street kid from Bogota, similar age and build. Your Carmen has been living under federal protection this entire time. Miguel's legs nearly gave out. The corridor tilted and spun as every moment of the last 17 years revealed itself as a lie. The grief counseling sessions where he'd learned to process his loss, the nightmares where he'd seen Carmen's face in the flames, the careful construction of Miguel Santos, prison guard, built on the foundation of Carmen Santos, murdered daughter. All of it. All of it had been a performance. Why tell me this now? He managed. Because they're done with her. Griselda's knuckles were white against the bars. Carmen's 28 now. She's been asking questions, trying to piece together her real past. The federal marshals who've been protecting her are getting nervous, and nervous people make terminal decisions. Santos! Morrison's voice was closer now. Final warning. Miguel turned halfway, seeing the tactical team spreading across the corridor entrance. 5 officers, full gear, weapons drawn but not yet aimed. They looked like men preparing for war, not a simple arrest. His mind raced through the implications. This wasn't about questioning. This was about permanent silence. The person behind all this, Miguel said desperately. Who is it? Griselda's smile was sharp as broken glass, but underneath it was something that looked almost like respect. Someone who's been playing a 30-year game, Miguel. Someone who's been using the drug war as cover for something much bigger. Someone who needed you alive just long enough to clean up the last loose ends. Give me a name. Deputy Director Sarah Hendricks, DEA. She's been running black operations since before you were a rookie agent. Tommy Reeves was just her puppet, and you, Griselda's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You were always meant to be her scapegoat. The name hit Miguel like a physical blow. Sarah Hendricks had been his supervisor's supervisor, a legendary figure in the DEA hierarchy. She'd personally approved his transfer to the Medellin task force, had shaken his hand at the commendation ceremony after he'd supposedly died in Colombia, had delivered a eulogy at his memorial service that had brought hardened agents to tears. Suddenly, every piece fell into place with devastating clarity. Hendricks hadn't just covered up Carmen's survival. She'd orchestrated the entire chain of events, the cartel connection that had gotten Miguel close to the truth, the warehouse ambush that had forced him underground, his resurrection as a prison guard in the perfect position to eliminate the one person who could expose her decades of corruption. She's here, Miguel said, the realization hitting him like ice water. Hendricks is here, isn't she? Griselda nodded almost imperceptibly. She arrived 20 minutes ago. Came to personally oversee your termination. Miguel's radio squawked one final time. Target is non-compliant. Authorization to use necessary force. That's when he heard it, a voice cutting through the tactical chatter behind him. Calm, authoritative, speaking with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to absolute power. "Make it clean, gentlemen. Officer Santos has clearly been compromised by his emotional attachment to this case." Miguel spun around, and there she was. Deputy Director Sarah Hendricks, 63 years old, silver hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn for decades. She looked exactly as he remembered from his DEA days, except for one thing: she was smiling. "Hello, Miguel. It's time to come home." Miguel stared at Sarah Hendricks across 20 feet of sterile corridor, and 17 years of carefully buried rage crystallized into something cold and lethal. She stood behind her tactical team like a general surveying a battlefield, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light, her smile carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent decades destroying lives with bureaucratic efficiency. "You know," Hendricks said, her voice carrying that same measured tone he remembered from briefing rooms and strategy sessions, "I always wondered if you'd figure it out eventually. Tommy Reeves certainly thought you were smarter than you appeared." Miguel's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Captain Morrison raised his rifle a fraction, not quite aimed, but ready. The message was clear: movement meant death. "Carmen," Miguel said, the name coming out like broken glass. "Where is she?" Hendricks tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. "Safe, protected. Living a perfectly normal life in Phoenix under the name Jennifer Martinez. She's a nurse, if you can believe it. Always had that caretaking instinct, even as a child." The smile widened. "She doesn't remember you, of course. Trauma counseling is remarkably effective when properly applied." Behind him, Miguel heard Griselda shift in her cell, but he didn't dare turn away from Hendricks. The deputy director's casual revelation felt like acid poured directly into open wounds. Carmen was alive, had been alive all this time, while he'd been dying slowly from grief and guilt. But she was also lost to him in a way that felt worse than death. The plastic surgery, the relocation, that wasn't to protect her, Miguel realized aloud. That was to protect you. "Right, boy." Hendricks clasped her hands behind her back, the gesture unconsciously military. "Carmen saw me at that meeting in Miami. Not just my face, but heard my voice giving very specific instructions about cartel cooperation and federal immunity. A 12-year-old witness to 30 years of carefully constructed treason." She paused, savoring the moment. Killing her would have been simpler, but bodies have a way of creating investigations. Ghosts, on the other hand, tell no tales. Miguel's mind raced through the implications, seeing the elegant brutality of the long game Hendricks had played. Create a dead daughter to motivate a grief-stricken father. Use that father's rage to eliminate cartel rivals. Then eliminate the father when he got too close to the truth. Clean, efficient, leaving no witnesses to decades of corruption. "You made me into a weapon," he said. "I made you into a very effective weapon," Hendricks corrected. "Your work in Colombia eliminated 17 of my competitors and consolidated cartel operations under more cooperative leadership. Your psychological profile made you perfectly predictable. Point you at a target, whisper your daughter's name, and watch you destroy everything in your path." Morrison's radio crackled. "Ma'am, we have multiple vehicles approaching the facility. Federal marshals, DEA tactical, and what looks like a media convoy." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Hendricks' face. "Impossible. This operation is classified at the highest levels." Behind Miguel, Griselda's voice carried quiet satisfaction. "I told you she was playing a longer game than you realized, Miguel. But you weren't the only one with friends in interesting places." Miguel turned to look at her, seeing something in Griselda's expression that finally made sense. Not the cold calculation of a killer, but the careful orchestration of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. Maybe years. "You knew," he breathed. "You knew all of this before I ever walked into this prison." "Carmen reached out to me 6 months ago," Griselda said simply. "Amazing what you can accomplish when you have a nursing degree and access to federal medical databases." She'd been tracking inconsistencies in her own history, following paper trails that led back to the Medellin cartel. "And from there," she shrugged. "I may be many things, Miguel, but I don't make war on children, especially not children whose fathers died trying to bring me to justice." Hendricks's composure was fracturing visibly. "Morrison, eliminate both targets, now." But Morrison's rifle was lowering, not raising. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see proper authorization for lethal force against a federal corrections officer." "I am your authorization." "No," Morrison said quietly. "You're not. Not anymore." The sound of vehicles grew louder outside, accompanied by the mechanical whine of helicopter rotors. Miguel could hear shouted commands echoing from the prison's outer perimeter, the organized chaos of a federal operation in motion. But all of it seemed distant compared to the collapse of certainty happening in Hendrix's eyes. 30 years, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. 30 years of building something that mattered, something that brought real order to chaos, and you're going to destroy it all for sentiment. Miguel looked at this woman who'd orchestrated his daughter's disappearance, his own psychological destruction, the deaths of countless people across 2 continents. He thought about 17 years of nightmares, of guilt that had eaten him alive, of carefully constructed grief built on deliberate lies. Then he smiled. "No," he said softly, "I'm going to destroy it all for justice." The word hung in the air like a verdict, and Miguel watched 30 years of Sarah Hendrix's carefully constructed empire crumble in her eyes. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the corridor filled with absolute silence. No radio chatter, no footsteps, just the electric hum of fluorescent lights bearing witness to the collapse of certainty. Then Hendrix laughed. It started low, almost conversational, but built into something sharp and brittle. "Justice?" she repeated, her composure reassembling itself with frightening efficiency. "You want to talk about justice, Miguel? Let's discuss the mathematics of the drug war. In 30 years, I prevented more cartel violence, saved more lives, and brought more stability to 2 continents than every honest agent combined. By becoming them," Miguel said quietly. "By selling information that got agents killed, by orchestrating murders, by destroying families, by accepting reality." Hendrix's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "You self-righteous fool. Do you think the world operates on bedtime stories about good and evil? I created order from chaos. I turned random violence into manageable business. Every death I authorized prevented 100 others." Miguel felt something settle in his chest, not peace, but a kind of terrible clarity. For 17 years he'd carried the weight of failure, of not being strong enough or smart enough to save his daughter. But standing here, seeing the true architect of his destruction finally exposed, he understood that some evils were too vast for any one person to prevent. The sound of boots echoed from multiple directions now, not just Morrison's tactical team, but federal agents moving through the prison with methodical precision. Hendrix glanced toward the sounds, and Miguel saw something he'd never expected to witness, fear in those calculating eyes. "Carmen will never know you existed," Hendrix said, her voice turning venomous. "Even if you expose everything, even if you bring down my entire network, she'll live and die as Jennifer Martinez. The psychological conditioning is permanent, Miguel. You've lost her forever, just in a different way than you thought." The words hit like physical blows, but Miguel found himself thinking of something else. Griselda's voice saying, "Don't make war on children." The idea that his daughter had reached out, had fought to uncover the truth about her own past. Carmen hadn't just survived, she'd become someone who sought answers, who refused to accept comfortable lies. "You're wrong," he said, and suddenly he was certain of it. She found the truth once. She'll find it again. Behind him, Griselda spoke with quiet intensity. "Miguel, the maintenance door behind my cell, it leads to the old tunnel system. Federal agents are already in position, but Hendrix brought her own people. This isn't over." Miguel turned to look at her, seeing not the cold killer he'd imagined for 17 years, but a woman who'd somehow found unexpected redemption in protecting the daughter of an enemy. The irony was devastating and perfect. The person he'd hated most in the world had become Carmen's unlikely guardian angel. "Why?" he asked. Griselda's smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "Because some debts can only be paid forward, Miguel. And because your daughter asked me to keep you alive long enough to learn the truth." The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the prison, not the controlled pops of handguns, but the sustained rattle of automatic weapons. Morrison's team spun toward the sound, their discipline fracturing as conflicting loyalties tore at their training. Hendricks pulled a compact pistol from her jacket with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd killed before. "Captain Morrison, your orders remain unchanged. Eliminate both targets." But Morrison was backing away, his rifle lowered completely now. "Ma'am, I'm Federal Corrections, not cartel enforcement. Find another gun." Miguel watched Hendricks' face cycle through rage, desperation, and finally a kind of terrible resolve. She raised the pistol toward Griselda's cell, her finger tightening on the trigger. "If I can't have justice," she said quietly, "I'll settle for vengeance." Miguel moved without thinking, 17 years of buried reflexes taking control. He lunged forward as the gun fired, feeling the bullet tear through his shoulder as he crashed into Hendricks. They went down hard against the concrete floor, the pistol skittering away into the darkness. For a moment they struggled in deadly silence, not the choreographed violence of movies, but the desperate, ugly reality of two people fighting for their lives. Hendricks was smaller but vicious, clawing at his eyes, driving her knee toward his wounded shoulder. Miguel felt his strength ebbing with each heartbeat, 17 years of prison guard routine no match for genuine desperation. Then federal agents flooded the corridor, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands that echoed off concrete walls like Judgment Day. Miguel rolled away from Hendricks and looked up to see a face he'd never expected to witness again. Older, changed by years and trauma, but unmistakably familiar. Carmen Santos stood among the federal agents, her nurse's training evident in the way she immediately moved toward his wounded shoulder. "Hello, Dad," she said softly. "We have a lot to talk about." The medical bay of FCI Dublin had never felt so much like sanctuary. Miguel sat on the examination table while Carmen, his daughter, alive and real and applying pressure to his bullet wound with practiced efficiency, worked in the kind of focused silence he remembered from her childhood. She'd always been careful with broken things. "The bullet went clean through," she said, her voice carrying the measured calm of someone accustomed to trauma. "You'll need surgery, but there's no arterial damage." She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "You were always lucky with near misses." Miguel wanted to laugh at that, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. "Lucky. 17 years thinking you were dead, and you call that lucky?" "No." Carmen's hands stilled against the bandage. "I call 17 years of your life stolen from you a tragedy. But we're both breathing right now, and Sarah Hendricks is in federal custody. That feels like a kind of luck." Through the small window, Miguel could see the controlled chaos of the federal operation winding down. News vans clustered beyond the prison gates like vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward a sky that looked impossibly clear for November. Hendricks' corruption network was unraveling in real time. 30 years of carefully buried crime suddenly dragged into fluorescent light. "Griselda," Miguel said suddenly. "Is she safe, protected? The federal prosecutors are very interested in what she has to say about cartel operations and dirty agents." Carmen's smile carried an edge of satisfaction. Turns out the infamous Black Widow kept remarkably detailed records of all her business partners, including the federal ones. Miguel closed his eyes, feeling something he'd almost forgotten, the absence of weight he'd carried so long it had become part of his skeleton. The guilt, the rage, the desperate need for vengeance that had shaped every decision for 17 years. All of it was dissolving like smoke, leaving behind something raw but clean. "I dreamed about you," he said quietly, "every night. Sometimes you were 12 years old forever, sometimes you aged with me. But you were always just out of reach, always asking me why I couldn't save you." Carmen's hand found his uninjured shoulder, her touch light but steady. "I had dreams too. A man with kind eyes who used to read me stories about knights and dragons. I could never see his face clearly, but I always felt safe when he was there." She paused. "My therapist said it was trauma displacement, creating idealized father figures to cope with abandonment. Turns out therapists aren't always right." "Jennifer Martinez," Miguel said, testing the name. Were you happy?" "Happy enough." Carmen's voice carried the complexity of someone who'd learned to build a life on uncertain ground. "The Garcias were good people. They knew I was in protection, but not why. They gave me stability, education, love in their own way. But there was always this hole where my real history should have been. Miguel thought about that. His daughter growing up with loving strangers, building a life on foundations of necessary lies, becoming someone entirely new while carrying the echo of who she'd been. It should have felt like loss, but instead it felt like a kind of miracle. Carmen had survived not just physical death, but the complete erasure of her identity, and still become someone who fought for truth. The nursing degree, he said, that wasn't coincidence. No. Carmen's smile was pure determination. Nurses have access to medical databases, federal patient records, trauma counseling files. It took me 3 years to piece together enough inconsistencies to start asking the right questions. And once I found evidence of my own plastic surgery, well, she shrugged. The rest was just detective work. And Griselda? Surprisingly easy to contact through prison mail. Even easier to convince once I showed her the documentation I'd found. Carmen's expression grew serious. She told me you were here, told me what you'd been going through. Said you deserved to know the truth, even if it destroyed both of you. Miguel looked at this woman who was his daughter but also a stranger. Someone who'd inherited his stubborn pursuit of justice but wrapped it in patience he'd never possessed. 28 years old, a trained nurse, someone who'd methodically torn apart a federal conspiracy to find her way back to a father she barely remembered. What happens now? He asked. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, her hands gentle against the bandage. Outside, Miguel could hear car doors slamming, journalists shouting questions, the mechanical whine of helicopter rotors growing distant. The world was moving on, processing this story into headlines and political scandals and eventually history. But here, in this small medical bay that smelled of antiseptic and possibility, time felt suspended. Now, Carmen said finally, we have 17 years to catch up on, and all the time in the world to figure out who we are when we're not running from the past. Miguel nodded, feeling something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: peace.